So here's how the story begins in Mark chapter 5. It says this: Jesus got into the boat again. Now, let's stop there. If you get seasick, you're really going to get seasick with Jesus. The book of Mark's like Jesus goes to this side of the lake, then he gets in the boat and goes to that side of the lake, and then there's a storm that happens in the middle of the lake, and then he goes back to the other side of the lake, and now we're in Mark chapter 5, and he's back in the boat again and went to the other side of the lake. If you look at the beginning of Mark chapter 5, it actually says he went to the other side of the lake. Now he's actually coming back from the other side of the lake in this thing. And when he went back to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. My little daughter is dying, he said. Please come and lay hands on her. Heal her so she can live. Now again, when we sometimes read the Bible, we read it as a very flat story. We read right past this, we burn through this, but let's put ourselves in Jairus' shoes. Maybe you're sitting in here this morning and you've lost a child and you know what that's like when your child is on death's doorstep and how hard that can be. Maybe you've never lost a child, but you know what it's like, or you know someone dear to you. And so this is where Jairus is in his life, this moment of despair, going to Jesus. But the text gives us some clues into who this man is, that he was the leader of a local synagogue. And when he got to Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading with him to come and heal his daughter. It says in verse 24, Jesus went with him, and the people followed the crowd. All the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding, and she had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them. But she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. Mark does this unique thing in his writing as he sandwiches this story together. As we see here, he really highlights this story. And oftentimes with this story, maybe you've read it before, maybe you've never seen it, but maybe you've read it before, and we can sometimes go into the very fine, minute details of the story, which there's great truths in there, but we're also going to pull back from this to try to see how these stories connect and how these stories intertwine. And so we have Jairus, who's on the way home with Jesus, and all of a sudden this woman, out of the whole crowd, there's a woman there, right? So off the bat, you're kind of like, well, of course there's a woman there. There's about 50 women. There's about 100 women, and there's 100 men. There's children, but yet there's a woman there who had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. And so the biggest thing when we pull back is we need to compare these two. Jairus was important and influential in his area where he lived. He was the ruler or the leader in the synagogue. This tells us who he is as a person. He's what we'd also consider clean in that environment or that religious society. He's considered clean. Because the woman, on the other hand, because of her bleeding, she's an outcast. Because in that society, according to Jewish law, when you bled as a woman, you were considered unclean while you were doing that. And so now she's bleeding for 12 years. Can you imagine that? She's an outcast, has no standing in society compared to Jairus is probably one of the most influential, deserving men in his community, looked up to. And this woman's on the outskirts of society, and she's considered unclean. There's other things about them. Jairus is wealthy. She's penniless. Jairus obviously has a family. Most scholars believe this woman has no family because she can't bear children. Maybe people would have left her to that way. And we know here that Jairus has a home because he's asking Jesus to come. And many people, again, scholars are just speculating that many people like this woman that would find herself in this type of situation, many people would find themselves homeless. Or if she did have a home, it probably wouldn't be much because she didn't have much she could do. You see, the interesting thing is, in this story, we find people of the utmost extremes in society. One at the top and one at the bottom, but we find something that connects them. Both are absolutely desperate in their life. Both are absolutely desperate in their life. So let's go on here in this story. When the woman heard about Jesus, She came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. Immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that the healing power had gone out from him, so he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said to him, "Look at the crowd pressing around you. How can you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept on looking around to see who had done it. Again, just think about that for the disciples for a moment. There's literally hundreds of people pressed upon Jesus, and they're like, "Dude, what are you talking about? Everybody's touching you." But there's one who stood out. Even though Jesus didn't know exactly who it was, he knew there was something different when this woman touched him. So Jesus is like, "All right, who did it?" And probably everybody's like, "Well, 15 of us are touching you. What do you mean, who touched you?" But the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. This is the part here that really begins to make us think about, what will others say, think, or do to me in life? You see, Jairus on one hand, we're going to see here in a couple minutes, Jairus on one hand, we're going to see him coming to Jesus. He could have lost his job because of who Jesus was. This woman, she could be utterly humiliated in front of everybody, but yet Jesus says, "Come on, who did it? Who did it?" And both of them are taking a risk in encountering Christ that day. They're taking a risk in encountering Christ. The woman could have been like, "Nope, I'm done. I'm out of here." She comes and falls. Let's think about that more for a moment. This is where I need your help. Why may we make choices based on what others think, say, or do to us? Why? Let's throw out some things. Approval, right? Deep down, inherent, right? We want approval. Or if we grew up in such a way that maybe we didn't have an approval of a parent or a father, maybe we strive for that. We want others to approve of us. Yeah, someone else threw something out there. What'd you say? Peer pressure? Okay, right? We think others, whether they might pressure us into something or think about something. Yeah. Pride? Sure, that's a huge one, right? Fear? Great. Acceptance? Right? We want people to like us. Afraid if people don't like us. Pride if we maybe get something wrong. Any other reasons? Why might we do this? Okay, societal norms. Qualifications. Okay, don't want to make the decision ourselves. Right, so we got this storm brainstorming right now. This is a great thing that we all have to look inside of our own hearts to say, are there things in life that I look to other people as what they might think, say, or do to me or us, whatever it might be? And we might even be so prideful that we're like, nah, that's not me. But as we kind of notch down our hearts to say, are there things in life that I am concerned about what others will think about me or do to me or say to me? But the ultimate question this morning is, whose voice are you going to listen to? You see, in this story, as we pull back from this, we actually see that there's a lot of voices that are happening in this story. And we're going to see some more as they come up. And so for all of us, we need to wrestle with whose voice are you going to listen to? Let's even take this for example right here. Jesus realized at once the healing power had gone out from him. We just looked at this. So he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said to him, "Look at the crowd pressing around you. How can you ask who touched me?" But he kept on looking around at who had done it. In this case, right now, we can see that this woman, frightened, fell to Jesus' feet because she listened to his voice. Who touched me? Who touched me? We're going to see something here, again, about them that draws Jairus and it draws this woman together. They both fell at Jesus' feet. In the beginning of this story, Jairus falls at Jesus' feet. Now, at this point in the story, the woman falls at Jesus' feet. And even though they're both extremes in society, they both fall at Jesus' feet. They both are utterly desperate, and they both take a risk. Let's go deeper on this idea. We've talked about risks. Let's go a little bit deeper on this right now. Jairus risked his reputation. We've already seen, leading up here in our series in Mark, what the synagogue leaders thought about Jesus. Mark chapter 2, they said, this is blasphemy. How can this man forgive someone's sins? Jairus literally risked his reputation and he risked his job by encountering Jesus that day. He also risked rejection. Anybody have a fear of rejection? I'm going to have you raise your hand because you're like, what are people going to think about me, right? But we've all probably thought about that at some point in our life. Risky rejection. He could have thought about it this way. I know what Jesus thinks about us as synagogue leaders. I know he's argued with the scribes and the Pharisees. What if I go to Jesus about my daughter and he's like, I'm not going to help you out. I know what you think about me. I know what you've said about me in front of other people. I know that you've even already proclaimed that I'm blasphemous. How would I dare help you? And he risks going to Jesus and saying, I have nothing else I can do, but I've heard the things you've done. I've seen some of the things you've done, and I need that in my life too. And he risks that rejection. The woman now risks humiliation, and she risks shame, because something we need to realize is this, that when Jesus calls out this woman, who touched my robe, and when this woman comes and says, it's me, it's me, it's me, and falls to his feet, people could have literally said, unclean, and they could have all ran because they all knew her in her plight. How many people would want to risk that? Risk in front of everybody being called out unclean, and they're all sprinting. Who knows that day? Maybe she put on 6 more layers so she could hide who she really was. So no one really knew who she was when she was in the crowd. She kind of remained secret and thought, if only I could touch the hem of his garment, that's all I need of Jesus. And what started out in secret, Jesus called into public in this woman's life. Faith, as we look at this idea of going from unbelief to belief in this series, faith requires that we take risks regardless of what others say, think, or do to us. Faith requires that. It requires that we listen to the voice of Jesus over the voice of others, the crowd, or what others say in our life. I did some additional research this week, and I'm not going to go crazy into it. I want to share 3 things about people taking risks in our society. So this was a study done, I think, in 2015, and you can see the source down here on the bottom left, and it had to do with risks. Here's just 3 of them. 66% of people stick close to friends they already have, not necessarily because they're uninterested in forming new friendships, but rather because they tend to avoid taking chances socially. 2/3 of society doesn't take risks when it comes to friend making. 72% said their personal interests tend toward activities that don't involve an element of risk. 76 prefers the stability and consistency of living in one place long term, not even willing to risk that in life. So we can see as society inherently, we don't take risks. At some point, we're really concerned what others might think, say, or do to us. But what we need to wrestle with today is, how desperate are you? How desperate are you for Jesus to show up in your situation? How desperate are you? How desperate are you for Jesus to show up in your situation? The Jairus was desperate. This woman was desperate. But how desperate are you? That if Jesus were to say, go and do this, that you would do that because you're that desperate to see him at work in your life. Let's go on in this story. The woman falls down at his feet and he says, daughter, your faith has made you well, right? Repent and believe. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. You see, the amazing thing is all these people were touching Jesus, but he knew one in the crowd had desperate faith, had a faith that believed that if she could just touch Jesus, he would show up. You see, the interesting thing about this word, though, faith, your faith has made you well, it's actually the word used there is to make the connection between faith and salvation. Daughter, your faith has saved you and made you well was really the ultimate translation of that. That she came to a place, that's why he uses this word daughter here. Again, find the connection points of this. Jairus had a daughter, and now this woman is a daughter of the king. That her faith had saved her and made her well. And this idea that to go in peace or your suffering is over means that you're going to go and live a life free of this suffering that you've encountered your last 12 years. All right. So I don't know about you, but if I'm Jairus, I'm like, why are we wasting our time with this woman when my daughter's dying? We just met Jairus, and this lady interrupts it. Jesus, in fact, is spending his time with this woman who's the outcast of society when Jairus has this important need laying there. While he was still speaking to her, messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. They told him, "Your daughter is dead. There's no use troubling the teacher now." But Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just have faith." We're going to see here from here on out, in this part, we're really going to see now honed in, whose voice are you listening to? The voices of the messengers said, "Your daughter is dead," final. And in that culture, when you were dead, it was a great marking of a death. Mourners would come in, and all these things would take place. Can you imagine that? Now, Jesus just spent his time with this woman. Your daughter's dead. But Jesus now says, don't be afraid. Just have faith. Whose voice are you going to listen to in those moments? The voice of Jesus or the voice of the messengers who knew? But whose voice are you going to listen to? What Jesus was saying to Jairus was this, and David Guzik sums it up pretty well. He says this: don't believe and be afraid at the same time. Don't try to believe and figure it all out. Don't try to believe and make sense of the delay. Instead, only believe. Jairus was supposed to believe the words of Jesus. Everything else told him the situation was hopeless, but the words of Jesus brought hope. Let's go on now. He says this, then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let anyone go with him. So they're still going. Peter, James, and John goes with him. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw much commotion, weeping, and wailing. Whose voice are you going to listen to? He went inside, and he said, "Why is all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead. She's only asleep." Whose voice are you going to listen to? There's something else we need to learn and understand about this, though, that maybe we wouldn't understand at the first surface. It says this: he went inside. In that culture, if someone died in the home was unclean for at least 7 days. If anybody had touched the dead body, they were unclean for a period of time. And they would scrub and they would wipe, and they had to wait a period of time. But here's the amazing part of this story, that Jesus joined them in their despair, willing to become unclean like them to step into the situation. That's the gospel right there. That Jesus steps into our utter mess to bring us hope. That is the face of the heart of the gospel. That Jesus steps into our mess and he meets us with hope. Jesus joined them in their despair, willing to become unclean, just like everybody now in this story. Jairus is now unclean. The woman is unclean. And probably people are saying other things. But in verse 40, it actually says, the crowd now laughs at Jesus. But he made them all leave and took the girl's father and mother and 3 disciples into the room where she was lying. Holding her hand, now Jesus is definitely unclean now, he holds the little girl's hand and he said to her, Talitha cum, which means little girl, get up. Now this word, just sidetrack real quick, Talitha cum is actually Aramaic, which Jesus would have spoke, which the New Testament's in Greek. But again, as we look at this idea of the series in Mark, Many scholars believe that Mark was writing what Peter had shared. And we see here that Jesus invites Peter into the room. And Peter's probably relaying this story to Mark. And Mark finds this fascinating, what Jesus says, and he puts it right there in the story for us. That is, Peter is in awe of what Jesus does. He puts the Aramaic of the special words that Jesus shares. Little girl, get up. And the girl, who was 12 years old, we had 12 years of bleeding and a 12-year-old girl, immediately stood up and walked around. They were overwhelmed and totally amazed, kind of like we've seen from time and time again with Jesus. Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened, and then he told them to give her something to eat. We see here, ultimately in this story, the utter despair of people and the hope Jesus has to offer. Now, in our time, in our place, it might not be that if someone is on death's door or they do die, that they will rise again here on this earth. But what we do know, because Jesus has risen, what Paul says, to be absent from the body, present with the Lord, we can believe that even that they are in the hands of Jesus there as well. And so we can see, though, but no matter what you're dealing with now, you can insert your own story that Jesus wants to meet you with hope in the face of your despair. But how desperate are you? Whose voice are you going to listen to? And are you willing to take a risk of whatever Jesus asks you to do? Are you willing to take that risk? And as we have been ending our sermons with our Kairos circle, this is a perfect one for today. What is Jesus saying to you, and how will you respond? If you say, Lord, here's my situation I'm walking through, what do you have to say about it? Not what do the crowds have to say about it, not what do the messengers have to say about it, not do what the people laughing at me have to say about it, but Jesus, what is it that you have to say about it? Because Jesus wants to meet you in your despair with hope. Hope. Hope is here, but also hope is eternal. That even though we may die here, if you're a believer in Christ, you're with him, and that's amazing hope that we have. But how will you respond? Will you listen to the voices of those you might be concerned with around you, or are you willing to listen to the voice of Jesus and do what he's calling you to do?